Hello and welcome to this four-part series where once again we're speaking with the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance, World Bank Group and the World Economic Forum, who have partnered up to investigate the impact of COVID-19 on fintech firms. Now, building on the findings and insights from its landmark COVID-19 Rapid Assessment Study back in 2020, the new research titled the Global COVID-19 FinTech Market Impact and Industry Resilience Study is setting out to collect information and data from firms across the globe to gain insights into fintech performance in the face of the pandemic, the steps they've taken to respond to customer requirements, and how regulatory factors have influenced their development throughout the pandemic. On the line now to talk us through their participation in the survey and what it means to the World Economic Forum is their financial innovation lead, Ben Weisman. So welcome, Ben. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Hannah. Very excited to be here.
It's great to have you on. I'm really looking forward to hearing about the survey, which of course you were involved in last year. So my first question then is why the forum was motivated to participate in the survey for a second year. Let's start there.
It's a great question. I guess in general, we are really excited to build on the findings from the initial survey. I think we learned a lot in that survey about how fintechs have been impacted, at least in the short term, from COVID-19 and from the sort of policy responses across the board to the pandemic. And so now a year later, we're starting to see maybe some longer term shifts in both consumer behavior as well as some of the business models that different firms are either making or putting in place that have become permanent. And so, I think as we get these responses to the survey, we're really going to get an understanding of, this pandemic clearly changed a lot of things in a lot of different industries. And in terms of fintech, what kinds of things are starting to look like they might be longer term shifts.
All right, thanks for the backstory there. So yeah, what about regulatory innovation? How has the pandemic helped to launch regulatory innovation, and in what ways is it improving financial inclusion for both the unbanked and the underbanked, say?
Yeah. So I look at like what's going on in the regulatory space in a few different ways. So I think on the one side, we definitely saw in the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance's regulatory impact study last year, we saw that fintech and financial innovation really moved up in terms of importance for a lot of regulators. And I think this can be like directly tied in some ways to the findings from the COVID impact survey that we were working on, that basically in most verticals, in most jurisdictions, we saw a pretty big increase in volumes of transactions conducted with fintech platforms. So, with that in mind, I think just thinking through what did the pandemic look like in most places, we had this big shift away from in-person interaction towards more digital interaction. And so some of the kinds of things that are required by financial regulators in some places, things like wet signatures and in-person ID checks for Know Your Customer, KYC requirements, these kinds of things were like no longer viable. And so, we started to see, at least temporarily, a shift away from those kinds of requirements, which, enabled a lot of different kinds of things from both financial institutions, incumbents, as well as fintechs. I think then we also started to see some of the fintechs brought into the fold for some of the policy or the financial relief schemes from some governments. And in this way, whether it was in the Paycheck Protection Program in the US, which was sort of a lending scheme, or something like a direct distribution through payments channels or through deposit accounts, bringing fintechs in sort of, brought them into like a new level of legitimacy, as well as introduced some maybe clear regulatory guidelines for those firms to participate in those programs. And then I think just, from the regulator perspective, when you think about supervising financial institutions, whether it be fintechs or whether it be banks, the pandemic made it impossible to actually spend time on site at banks, which was traditionally how this kind of supervision was done. And so we saw a move in a lot of cases, at least anecdotally, towards adopting or exploring reg tech solutions, solutions that make it easier or at least more possible for regulators to do their job digitally and for firms to report what they need to report to regulators digitally. And then, so I think, just thinking about classic regulatory innovation like sandboxes across the board, the regulators started to see a lot more interest in accelerating these and in making sure that these were viable ways for fintechs to start to operate in a regulated fashion or licensed fashion.
All right, thanks, Ben. You've highlighted some significant developments there, and I think it's safe to say we've seen FinTech increasing the prevalence of digital payments, haven't we? But can you tell us a bit about why, and how is this empowering emerging markets and also developing economies?
Yeah, I think payments is sort of a really interesting area because in many ways, it's probably where a lot of financial innovation has begun, just because historically there's just been so much inefficiency in payments, both in terms of like what it takes for a consumer to actually make a payment, whether it be domestic or cross-border, as well as what the actual costs of those payments have been. And so we saw in emerging markets and developing countries, especially, a relatively early uptake of mobile payments, not using smartphones, just traditional peer-to-peer mobile payments. And I think from there, we started to see a lot of growth in all different kinds of mobile payment services. And I think just now we are entering a phase where we're starting to see real action to bring down the cost of cross-border payments for all kinds of consumers. I think historically, there's just been a huge cost to making a remittance payment, for example, that disproportionately affects consumers in low-income countries. And we're now starting to see both government action and central bank action to bring down those costs, but also the private sector introducing a lot of options that are accessible for consumers and that are a lot more cost effective.
So watch this space, I think it's safe to say. And also, finally, then I want to talk a bit more about the findings of the report and their impact. How will the findings work to shape other agendas and initiatives underway at the World Economic Forum? I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah. So we've been doing a lot of work on both fintech and also more broadly innovation and technology in the financial services space for several years now. And I think, initially this was sort of something that existed on its own. And now we're starting to see that innovation, new technology really goes across a lot of different kinds of things that we are looking at. And so I think this report in particular will help us really understand how is the ecosystem shifting? How are things changing? And what is the role of fintechs in that ecosystem in different countries going to look like moving forward? So, when we're thinking about what are the big gaps in whether it be in research or in policy guidance or what have you, that we're trying to help bring some light to, this report might help us really narrow down on like where are the big changes going to be seen.
Well, I'm really looking forward to reading the report and encouraging those to get involved in the survey and complete that. But Ben, thank you so much for giving us your insights today, and looking forward to speaking with World Bank as well. But until then, I hope we get to meet further down the line. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah.